Briefly, there's some connectivity issue. Let's hope for the best.
दुबे सर आप अनम्यूट कर सकते हैं, सिद्धार्थ मेनन सर अनम्यूट कर सकते हैं, स्टार्ट कर दुबे सर अनम्यूट कर सकते हैं.
Okay, so we'll begin now.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see a large number of people joining our Indore Krishnamurti Study Circle. Today we have Mr. Siddhartha Menon as our speaker. Most of you would be knowing him because he has spoken to this group earlier also. But for those who are joining for the first time, I'll briefly introduce Siddharth. And Siddharth association with KFI has been for more than 3 decades. He was a student of Rishi Valley School, and after finishing his school, he joined Delhi University, from where he did his MA in English. And after that, he came back to KFI again. He has been a teacher at Uttarkashi, a school run by KFI, then in Rajghat Basin School, and also in Rishi Valley, where he was principal for many years. Presently, Siddharth is director of the Rajghat Basin School. He writes poetry. He's a marathon runner, and he's also a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation India. Today, Siddharth is going to speak to us on Krishnamurti's The Song of Life, soul making and poetry. I'm sure Siddharth will bring his own poetry also along with K's writings. With these words, I welcome Siddharth once again, and I'm really thankful that Siddharth could find time to join. With these words, Siddharth, please go ahead. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Dubeji, for your kind introduction. And thank you also to Sushilji and the Indore Study Circle for inviting me again. I was hoping that after my last talk, they would not invite me again. But Sushilji had asked me that time to do something relating to poetry and to read some of my poems, so I dodged him for as long as I could, because I felt that this was not a space for reading poetry. However, I've taken his suggestion in the sense that I would like to see if there's a way of approaching Krishnamurti through poetry, including Krishnamurti's own poetry. And because of Sushilji's kind request, at the very end, perhaps I'll read one of my poems as well, but only because it relates to what we'll be talking about today. So thank you again. Before going on, I would also like to thank my friend and colleague Nidhi, who had an early look at what I was planning to present here and was very encouraging, but also asked me some questions that I needed to think about. So I'm going to be presenting my screen for most of today's session, because I'm going to be reading texts for a lot of the time, and I think it will be easier for you to follow the text if you can also see the text. So let me in fact start by sharing my screen, and then we'll get into the presentation. Is that visible? Is my screen visible, Dubeji?
Yes.
Yes, visible, sir.
Okay, right. Thank you. So this is my title, Krishnamurti's The Song of Life, Soul Making and Poetry. And maybe I should say a little bit about the title first. Now, the Song of Life is a sequence of 32 poems that Krishnamurti wrote in the 1920s. It was published by the Star Publishing Trust of the Theosophical Society in 1928, along with some of Krishnamurti's other early writings, many of which were in fact poems. Later in life, Krishnaji, as we know, didn't really write uh, much poetry, though his language was often poetic, especially in his descriptions of nature and so on. But early on in the 1920s, he certainly wrote poems. And I thought it would be nice to look at some of those early poems and to see if there was something that we could look at together there. So a lot of today's presentation will be focused on this particular work, Krishnamurti's The Song of Life, some selections from it. And my subheading is soul making and poetry. Now, soul making may seem like an odd phrase, and I'll come back to it in a moment because it's actually borrowed from somebody else who used that phrase, and I'll come to it. Uh, and I have as an epigraph here a quote from an American poet, a contemporary poet who died a few years ago, Mary Oliver. And she says, to pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. And I wanted to put this in because I think in some ways the subtext of my presentation today is really the quality of attention. And I find very often in conversations about Krishnaji's teachings and discussions and dialogues that we have, it's like all roads leading to Rome, really. At some point, we seem to come back to the question of attention. And I think poetry is very fundamentally concerned with attention too, which is why I wanted to bring this in. And maybe I should clarify at the outset when I say attention, if you look the word up in a dictionary, in some dictionaries, it's equated with concentration, a state of very focused looking at something or the other. But as we probably know, Krishnamurti used the word somewhat differently. In fact, he opposed attention to concentration. Attention was a sort of state of being, really, a state of openness that was receptive to everything rather than concentration on any one narrow thing. So the veil of soul making. Now, I said I'd say something about soul making, which is an odd phrase. Perhaps I don't think Krishnamurti talked much about the soul. And I'm referring to a poet who Krishnamurti was in fact particularly fond of. And this is John Keats, the romantic poet, the English romantic poet who died very young in about 1820. And Keats, apart from his poems, wrote remarkable letters to his brothers and to friends, in which some of his ideas about poetry were, let us say, embodied. And this striking phrase, the veil of soul making, is in one of these letters. And in this letter, what he does is he criticizes the conventional Christian notion that the world is a valley of sorrow and that you're doomed to suffering and sorrow throughout your life, and that the only end to it is when God intervenes after death and in heaven you find bliss. And Keats says rubbish, okay? And let us see what he says in its place. So he says the common cognomen, or let us say name, of this world among the misguided and superstitious is a vale of tears, from which we are to be redeemed by a certain arbitrary interposition of God and taken to heaven. What a little circumscribed, straitened notion. In other words, what a limited idea. He says, call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making. Then you will find out the use of the world. So what does he mean by soul making? Now, one clue is in the next paragraph. He says, I will call the world a school instituted for the purpose of teaching little children to read. I will call the human heart the hornbook used in that school. A hornbook was an educational book, like a textbook. And I will call the child able to read the soul made from that school and its hornbook. Now, I think this would be very interesting to those of us who are familiar with Krishnaji's thought, because he talks about, reading the book of life. And what Keats is saying is something similar, to read the book, which is the human heart, and to grow through that. I'll come back to this idea of the book of life a little later in the presentation. And then Keats says, do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? A place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. In other words, pain, suffering, we need not see these as troubles that are inevitable, but as ways, as means to growth. That's what he is suggesting. So, and this again comes close to something to a lot, in fact, in Krishnamurti's thinking. And I'd like to begin with a very poignant instance of it, and that takes us into the poem Song of Life. You would probably know that Krishnamurti's own, perhaps most profound experience of sorrow was the loss of his brother Nitya in 1925. He was very close to his brother, and when Nitya died, Krishnamurti went through intense anguish, and that was in some sense a life-defining experience for him. And one of the poems in this sequence, in fact, more than one, refers to this. So I'd like to begin there. So the Song of Life, and now I'll be referring to some extracts from this long poem, and not necessarily in sequence. However, I have themed, I'm trying to create a kind of narrative, a thematic narrative through this reading of the poems. And the first theme I've identified is the freeing of sorrow. Now, I've put this in this manner somewhat deliberately. You might expect the freeing from sorrow. But I would like to see this differently, because it's not so much, the desire to be free from sorrow that I'm interested in, but the freeing action that sorrow brings about. The experience of sorrow in some way becomes a catalyst to some sort of inward change. So it's a freeing action of sorrow rather than a freeing from sorrow. And there's another sense in which I'm putting it this way, which is, I think the idea of sorrow needs to be freed from the negative connotations we have of it. Sorrow is something to be evaded at all costs if possible. But instead, we need to free that notion of sorrow in order to see what its possibilities are. Hence the freeing of sorrow. So this is section 22, and I've excerpted it. And this is a very direct and rather moving poem. My brother died, we were as two stars in a naked sky. He was like me, burnt by the warm sun in the land where are soft breezes, swaying palms and cool rivers, where there are shadows numberless, bright-colored parrots and chattering birds. He died. I wept in loneliness. Wherever I went, I heard his voice and his happy laughter. I looked for his face in every passerby and asked each if he had not met with my brother. But none could give me comfort. I worshipped, I prayed, but the gods were silent. I could weep no more. I could dream no more. I sought him in all things, in every clime. I heard the whispering of many trees calling me to his abode. And then in my search, I beheld thee, O Lord of my heart. In thee alone I saw the face of my brother. In thee alone, O my eternal love, do I behold the faces of all the living and all the dead. Now, there are many interesting things in this poem, and we don't have time to talk about all of them. I'll just indicate perhaps one or two. One is this language of thee, I beheld thee. This is not something that you would find in the later Krishnamurti, where he seems to be addressing some kind of divine presence. Of biographical interest, it may be useful to know that at that time in the 1920s, Krishnamurti had a deep feeling for Buddhism. which I think never left him actually. And this the figure could be identified with something like the Buddha, if not the Buddha. The other thing I'd like to point out is the way these last two stanzas end. You know, after this entire quest and praying, worshipping, everything, he says at the end of the second stanza, second last stanza, in thee alone I saw the face of my brother. And then he says, in thee alone, O my eternal love, do I behold the faces of all the living and all the dead. Now, I think the difference between the way these two stanzas end is very fundamental. The second last stanza is still very personal. I saw the face of my brother. And then I behold the faces of all the living and all the dead. Suddenly, the poem is no longer personal. Something else has happened. It's as if the personal has become the universal. And there's the presence of all the living and all the dying in whatever is beheld there. It's as if that experience of sorrow has, in some sense, made it possible for this personal experience of sorrow to become something much vaster. And I'll come back to this in a minute. But now I'd like to go to the very first poem in the sequence. And again, I've excerpted, and it relates to what I was just saying. Make of thy desire the desire of the world, of thy love the love of the world. In thy thoughts take the world to thy mind. Awakened from the heart of love, my voice is the voice of understanding, born of infinite sorrow. So, two things here. Again, personal desire becomes the desire of the world. Likewise with love. So, this, you see here the beginnings of, you know, what was later to be embodied in Krishnamurti's statement that we are all familiar with. You are the world. There's no difference psychologically. But what is it to actually perceive the truth that you are the world? Apart from it as an idea, what is it to actually perceive it? I'll return to that question, but here it looks as if in this poem, you have a movement towards that perception that there's no difference between the individual and the world. And finally, the last two lines of that poem, my voice is the voice of understanding, born of infinite sorrow. So this is, you know, what I was talking about earlier. So sorrow becomes a catalyst to understanding. So sorrow, in that sense, is a positive presence in our lives. So, you know, we don't need to seek to be free from sorrow, but there's a freeing action that sorrow can bring about. In fact, Krishnamurti goes further. If you look at the next section, which is in fact section 20, as I said, I'm not going chronologically, but thematically. He says, invite sorrow. Out of the fullness of thy heart, invite sorrow, and the joy thereof shall be in abundance. Right? Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it for yourself. But you see that sorrow he's seeing as something that opens something up. It opens what he calls the closed doors of thy heart. The cry of sorrow is the voice of fulfillment, and the rejoicing therein is the fullness of life. And this will take us into the next theme, the fullness of life, which is again a very familiar theme for those of us who have been reading or studying Krishnamurti. And finally, in this section, I'd like to quote a piece of prose which I find deeply moving. And this was after he's referring to this experience of losing his brother and what has changed within him. An old dream is dead and a new one is being born as a flower that pushes through the solid earth. A new vision is coming into being and a greater consciousness is being unfolded. A new strength born of suffering is pulsating in the veins, and a new sympathy and understanding is being born of past suffering. A greater desire to see others suffer less. And if they must suffer, to see that they bear it nobly and come out of it without too many scars. I have wept, but I do not want others to weep. But if they do, I know what it means. Now, as I said, I find this deeply moving because you see Krishnamurti's very human side. And you see also the connection in some sense between his suffering and, let us say, his compassion. I remember long ago, once during perhaps one of the first gatherings I attended as a young teacher in Rishi Valley, asking someone, uh, how is it that Krishnamurti spoke about with so much insight about, let us say, human unintelligence, conflict, and this and that? Because it looked as if he himself was not in that. So, how did he speak about it with so much insight? And I think that's a question which has remained with me. And I think one answer to it is that, in fact, he experienced a great deal of what we all experience. But he seemed to have been able to experience it with a kind of completeness because he wasn't running away from it, which is what we tend normally to do. And through that experiencing of it in completeness, I think something changed. So that's just a comment I thought I'd like to make. And this brings me, this fullness of life to the next theme that I want to explore through these poems, life in its fullness. And here from the 16th poem, love the whole tree, then thou shalt love the shapely branch, the tender and the withered leaf, the shy bud and the full-blown flower. Our love life in its fullness, it knoweth no decay. Now, this is again, I think, very beautiful and comes to the heart of something very central to Krishnamurti, which is to see life in an unfragmented way. I mean, we tend, of course, to see the things that we feel positive about, like, for example, the tender flower or the tender leaf, and to be less interested in, let us say, the withered leaf. And for Krishnamurti, the whole thing is part of one movement of life, hence life in its fullness. And there is no decay, because decay is only of the part. The whole does not decay. And I'd like here to refer to another poem, and this is a poem, in fact, by John Keats again. And I think Keats had the same insight. And the context in which I'd like to refer to Keats is a poem about the seasons, in fact, specifically about autumn. There's a poem called To Autumn by Keats. And you see, autumn in England, which is where Keats was writing, is on the one hand a time of fullness because, everything is ripe and ready to pluck. But it's also a time of emptiness because after the harvest and the plucking, the trees are bare, the trees lose their leaves, the fields are bare after the harvest. And of course, autumn is just, sort of paving the way for winter. And in England, winter is a bleak season. So autumn has all kinds of negative connotations. But Keats, in his poem, marvelously shows you how autumn needs to be seen as part of an entire cycle of seasons. And in fact, autumn, even within itself, embodies all of the seasons. So here, I'm just quoting from the last stanza of the poem. And he asks, where are the songs of spring? We long for spring. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? And then he says, think not of them, thou hast thy music too. And he's talking now about the music of autumn. Why worry about the music of spring when autumn has its music? And then he evokes the beauty of the sunset on the stubble fields, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. So he's saying that autumn is beautiful. It has its own beauty. It has its own music. And then he goes further in the rest of the stanza. I won't read the whole thing, but he evokes the songs of autumn. And he evokes the sound of the lambs, the hedge crickets, the redbreast, which is a bird, and the swallows. Now, what is interesting is the redbreast is a bird associated with spring, and the swallows are birds associated with early summer. So, in this sort of vision that he has, he sees all of the seasons present in autumn. So, it's certainly an instance of, the part representing the whole, like, where Krishnamurti says, see the whole tree and not just the parts. So, I thought it's an interesting parallel, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why Krishnamurti was so drawn to a poet like Keats. And that takes me to the next theme, which is similar. The large is in the small. And here Krishnamurti's his image is of a raindrop. Does the raindrop hold in its fullness the raging stream? Does the raindrop in its loneliness feed the solitary tree on the hill? Does the raindrop in its great descent create the sweet sound of many waters? Does the raindrop in its pureness quench the aching thirst? So you see how he expands the single raindrop into its significance in the whole world, right? This is a very, let us say, ecological kind of perspective, seeing the connection between things in this particular way. And then he says, it is the unwise who chase the shadow of self in life, and life eludes them, for they wander in the ways of bondage. In other words, I think to see this connection between the small and the large, to see the whole and the part, right, requires in some sense a setting aside of the self. Now, it's another question how you do that. I won't enter into that now. But he sees the self as coming in the way of that, because the self is divided, fragmented, and divides itself from the rest of the world. Wherefore the struggle and loneliness of division? In life, there is neither you nor I. Right? So again, I mean, I don't need to say more about this. I think it's just worth looking at the way the images are just tumbling out in these poems. And these are images which take us, I think, into the heart of key ideas in, let us say, Krishnamurti's mature thought, which is what we are more familiar with. The vocabulary changes, the mode changes, but I think the seeds of what he was saying later are very much there in this early poem. So there's neither you nor I, which leads us to the question of, you are then the world, but then what happens to individual identity? Because of course we are attached to our notions of ourselves. But before that, in life, there's neither you nor I. Here is a very famous mystical statement of the same thing by another English poet, an earlier contemporary of Keats, writing in the late 18th century, William Blake. 4 lines which are very famous. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. So again, you see a kind of mystical perception of the whole and the part. And so Krishnamurti was not new in articulating some of these ideas, though of course he had his own way of putting them. So anyway, to get back to my question, in life there's neither you nor I, then who am I? What is individual identity? So that leads me to my next theme. If you are the world, what happens to individual identity? And one of the poems in this sequence, I think, pretty directly addresses this. It's a series of both negations and positive statements. I have no name. I am as the fresh breeze of the mountains. I have no shelter. I am as the wandering waters. I have no sacred books, nor am I well seasoned in tradition. I'm not bound by theories nor corrupted by beliefs. I'm not held in the bondage of religions. My song is the song of the river calling for the open seas. Wandering, wandering, I am life. Now it's very interesting that, the things which he says I'm not, if you just list them, it's no name, no shelter, no sacred books, no tradition, no theories, no beliefs, no religions. And of course, we know that Krishnamurti kept coming back to this. So what is it? What are the things he says he is? And they are all drawn from nature. The fresh breeze of the mountains, the wandering waters, the song of the river, the open seas, a state of wandering, and he's calling this life, right? And I can't resist here sharing with you another poem by another wonderful poet, and this is the 19th century American poet, Emily Dickinson, who, in a somewhat playful way, says something much the same in terms of negation. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise. Now, what I love in this poem is the sort of playfulness in the way it moves, the conversational playfulness. But there's also a warning here. You see, nobody can also become an identity if you're not careful. If you identify with it, I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Let's not talk about it, is what she's saying. And then she says, how dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. So being somebody, which is what, of course, most of us are preoccupied with all the time, is, as she says, dreary. It's like a frog publicizing itself. But let me move now to the next theme. So Krishnamurti seems to reject the idea of individual identity, but he does not reject individual experience. In fact, for him, the quest for truth begins with individual experience. In his famous speech where he said, truth is a pathless land and nobody can lead you to it, implicit in that is the notion that you have to find your own way. Your quest begins in your own experience. And this idea is also there in this early poem, in this image of the dust of individual experience. As the spark that shall give warmth is hid among the grey ashes, so, O friend, the light which shall guide thee under the dust of thine experience. So it's your experience that can be the light that guides you, nothing else. You can't look for that light elsewhere. And he comes back to it in the next section. O friend, thou canst not bind truth. It is as the air, it hath no dwelling place. O friend, leave heresy to the heretic, religion to the orthodox, but gather truth from the dust of thine experience. So again, here, a notion that, first of all, truth cannot be held. You cannot contain it in some tight way. You cannot bind it. And also, he seems to suggest it cannot be located in any precise location. It is as the air, it hath no dwelling place, right? And again, he rejects either religion or anti-religion. Heresy is, unorthodox. And also he rejects the orthodox. Gather truth from the dust of thine own experience. So the second last theme that I'd like to refer to. So truth, so where does truth lie and what is understanding? And of course, so much can be said about this. And in the poem that I'm going to share with you here, he talks about the mode of it. How do you approach truth? What is it you can do to approach it? And he says, and there are a series of, let us say, dualities. Reason is the treasure of the mind, love is the perfume of the heart, yet both are of one substance, though cast of different molds. So here he's opposing reason and love, mind and heart. And he's saying actually they're no different. They must go together. Then he says, as a golden coin bears two images parted by a thin wall of metal, so between love and reason is the poise of understanding. That understanding which is of both mind and heart. Now, I find that very finely phrased. It's one of the poetic highlights for me of this entire sequence when he speaks about the poise of understanding. Because the word poise is so rich. On the one hand, at an obvious level, poise suggests balance, a kind of condition of equilibrium. So, understanding is a kind of poise between mind and heart, between both of them. But you know, the word poise also suggests um, departures. You know, when you're poised to do something, you're on the verge of moving somewhere. So when he uses the phrase poise of understanding, to me it also suggests the, let us say, dynamic quality of understanding. Understanding is not an end in itself, it's a movement. It's a poise to further understanding. Let me put it that way. So I find this phrase very rich. O life, O beloved, in thee alone is eternal love, in thee alone is everlasting thought. So again, this embodiment of love and thought, whether it's the golden coin or whether it's this figure that he refers to as the beloved. And I think this is worth keeping in mind because so much of what we call inquiry is in fact a rational process. You know, even discussion, looking at things, trying to make sense of them rationally. But clearly, he seems to be saying that that's not enough, that's only one part of it. And the question is, of course, how do we approach this other thing, what he calls love? Or what we may want to, using a later language, call attention. And just again, a very playful extract, somewhat playful extract from another poet. This is W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet. And look what he says. God, guard me from those thoughts men think in the mind alone. He that sings a lasting song thinks in a marrow bone. In other words, thought is not a process of the mind alone, but must, in some sense, arise from the entire being. Which brings me to the last of the themes that I'd like to explore in this poem. And after this, I'll move a little bit very briefly into poetry itself, which is doubt and not knowing. Now, earlier we saw how for Krishnamurti, sorrow is not something that needs to be seen negatively. Sorrow, in fact, is a catalyst to growth and understanding. Likewise, doubt. And there's another word he uses, which we'll come to because it's a more familiar word from his later thought. Doubt is as a precious ointment. Though it burns, it shall heal greatly. Now, that's a striking image. Doubt as an ointment which burns when you have a cut, but it also heals. I tell thee, invite doubt when in the fullness of thy desire. Call to doubt at the time when thine ambition is outrunning others in thought. Awaken doubt when thy heart is rejoicing in great love. So whether it's in desire, ambition, love, he's saying, allow doubt its place, allow doubt to enter. I tell thee, doubt brings forth eternal love. Doubt cleanses the mind of its corruption, so the strength of thy days shall be established in understanding. For the fullness of thy heart and for the flight of thy mind, let doubt tear away thine entanglement. So again, heart and mind, and the role that doubt plays with both. And characteristically now, an image from nature. As the fresh winds from the mountains that awaken the shadows in the valley, so let doubt call to dance the decaying love of a contented mind. Now that's again a powerful phrase. The decaying love of a contented mind. Let not doubt enter darkly thy heart. I tell thee, doubt is as a precious ointment, though it burns, it shall heal greatly. So a contented mind he sees as being in a state of decay. And of course, a word that Krishnamurti uses more frequently later on is discontent. And discontent is again seen as a positive thing because it is a catalyst to inquiry. And doubt, of course, he says, doubt, so let doubt call to dance the decaying love. So, in other words, it activates a mind that is otherwise contented. Now, that brings me to the end of reading from these extracts from Krishnamurti. But this whole, the importance of doubt or not knowing is again central to Keats's thought as well. And I'd like to share with you two striking phrases that Keats uses. One is what he calls negative capability. And let me read this paragraph. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me the quality that went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Now, that's so beautifully put. So, negative capability is man's capacity of remaining in uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without what he calls an irritable reaching after fact and reason. And, if one is honest with oneself, one is often in that latter state because we usually find uncertainty uncomfortable and would prefer to search for certainty, even if it's only of a completely rational and verbal kind. So the state of remaining being able to remain in uncertainty, and he's not talking about a lazy uncertainty, which says, anyway, there's nothing I can do about it. This is beyond me. But it's an uncertainty that is awake, alert, interested, but not fretting for certainty. And he says that Shakespeare possessed this because Shakespeare, of course, inhabited all the characters that he created. The hundreds of characters he creates in his plays, not one of them is Shakespeare. But Shakespeare is, in some sense, inhabiting all of them because he was capable of, he was able to embrace what Keats is calling negative capability, a state of openness. And here's another striking phrase, the chameleon poet. And we need to remember that a chameleon changes colors all the time. The poetical character is not itself, it has no self. It is everything and nothing. It has no character. Again, this idea of no identity. It enjoys light and shade, it lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, rich or poor, mean or elevated. What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. And just before this phrase, Keats refers to two of Shakespeare's famous characters. One is Iago, who's one of Shakespeare's most terrible villains. And the other is Imogen, who's one of Shakespeare's most virtuous heroines. And what Keats is saying is, we distinguish between a villain and a hero, a virtuous person and an evil person, right? And a virtuous philosopher would be shocked by evil. But he says, not so the poet. The poet is delighted by everything because, again, everything is life. And to be open to everything is to be open to all of life rather than to be open only to what we feel is acceptable. And I think these thoughts come very close to some of the things we've seen in those passages from Krishnamurti. So just quickly to recap, these are the themes, the 7 themes that I touched upon while looking at the Song of Life poems. The freeing of sorrow, and I already said why the freeing of sorrow rather than the freeing from sorrow. Life in its fullness, the large is in the small. If you are the world, what happens to individual identity? The dust of individual experience, truth and understanding, doubt and not knowing. And this was, of course, framed by Keats first talking about the veil of soul making, and then talking about negative capability and the chameleon poet. So this is the bulk of my presentation, and but now very briefly, for I hope not more than maybe 5 or at the most 10 minutes, I'd like to say a little more about poetry. And why I'd like to do this is because, uh, I've been engaging fairly seriously with poetry for now many years. And I've often had a sense that that engagement is in some way my way, let us say, of coming upon or engaging with the things that Krishnamurti was speaking about. And I'd like to say a few things about poetry to try and indicate how this is so. Some of them I've already implied. But what, first of all, do we mean by poetry? How do we define poetry? Now, one could spend days on this, but I will not. I will instead quote from a poem. And I think what she says about poetry is perhaps the best way of looking at poetry. And this is one of my favorite poets, a Polish poet called Wisława Szymborska. There's a poem called Some People Like Poetry. And in the third stanza, she asks the question, what is poetry? And in a way, she answers it. And you'll see why I'm saying in a way. So this is Szymborska in the third stanza, poetry. But what is poetry anyway? More than one rickety answer has tumbled since that question first was raised. But I just keep on not knowing, and I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. Now, this is beautifully put. First, she's saying, at an obvious level, what she's saying is, I don't know. And the fact that I don't know is not a problem. Not only is it not a problem, but it's something that she clings to. What she says, she clings to it. But I think there's more to it. When she says, I keep on not knowing, I think what she's saying is that not knowing is at the heart of poetry. It's not just that she doesn't know what to say about poetry, but in some way, she's saying, well, this is what poetry is. Poetry begins with not knowing. And in fact, she speaks about this explicitly in the lecture that she gave when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But I just would like to highlight this point, the importance of not knowing. But as I said, it's not a kind of defeated not knowing. It's a not knowing that's interested, alert, and active. And a few things I wanted to say about poetry. There's a lot one could say, but a few things which I feel are important and relevant to today's talk. First, poetry is interested in the unknown and the not knowable. Very often, poetry is traversing this ground, let us say, of things which are not clearly known. If they were clearly known, I would say there would be no need for poetry. So you don't need a poem to give instructions about how to use a washing machine, for example, because it's clear-cut enough. But there are areas of experience which we don't know, and that's often the province of poetry. Yet, it seeks to capture the truth of experience. Now, you may not know how to define an experience, but you know you've had an experience. And so you want to try and identify what that experience was as truthfully as possible. And you don't know what that truth is, but perhaps you know what isn't true. So, very often, I find when I'm working on a poem about something, that work is to a large extent a process of eliminating. You write things and then you realize that the things you've written somehow catch in your throat. They don't seem to be true to the experience that you had. And you delete those things. And finally, you're left with something which seems true. And I think this is again an idea, an approach that's familiar to people interested in Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti often defines through negatives. So if we are talking of goodness, for example, Maybe we don't know what goodness is, but maybe we can recognize what is not good. So the third thing, it begins in individual experience but breaks boundaries. Now, of course, truth begins and poetry, the poetic quest also begins in your own experience for it to be authentic. But if that exploration is serious, it goes beyond the self and it becomes universal. In some ways, like that experience of sorrow that Krishnamurti describes, which finally allows him to perceive all sorrow. Its mode of understanding involves heart and head. You know, a poem is never a purely rational process, but a poem is also not merely a gushing of emotion. Because everybody has emotions and everybody can gush with emotions, but not everybody is a poet. I think there's a dynamic interplay between, let us say, heart and head, between reason and feeling and attention, which I'll come to in a moment. Poetry sees the large and the small. I won't say more about this, I've already spoken about this. It sees the inner in the outer. So it's interested in the inner life of things, in what is inwardly true. Its state of being is attention. If you remember, I quoted Mary Oliver at the beginning. Attention is our most proper work. And attention, this attention as opposed to concentration, to me, it seems is at the heart of poetry. That's where poetry begins, when you're attentive, both to the thing outside and to your responses to it. So you're attentive to that entire movement between the inner and the outer. It needs quietness and no direction. Now, I've put these words in quotes, and there's a reason for that. In one question and answer session at Sanan, a questioner asked Krishnamurti, what do you mean when you say that you can read the book of life in an instant? Because I think Krishnamurti had said that at one place, that you don't read it sequentially, but you see the whole thing. And Krishnamurti, in his response to that question, uses the metaphor of a map. He says, if you look at a map and you're trying to find your way from one place to another, your looking already has a direction. You're looking for one particular thing. But you can also look at a map and see the entire map and everything on it without any direction. And so he says, what you need to do is to look without direction and also in a state of quietness. When he says the brain is quiet and is in a state of quietness. And I think this is exactly true of the process of poetry. Because if you start with direction, if you start with a goal, with a theme, some idea, I think you sort of kill the poem before it's even born. I think it needs that sort of openness, a directionless kind of quality for something meaningful to happen. And finally, a poem is an entity, but no poem is an end in itself. A poem is, of course, an object. It is an entity. It's a closed object. But, you know, at the end of every poem, your mind is, if it is still attentive, the seeds of the next poem are already there. Poetry doesn't end with a poem, just as looking does not end with one moment of insight. So, as you see, there are a lot of parallels between these statements I've made about poetry and what Krishnamurti was saying. So finally, and this is only because Sushilji sort of pressed me repeatedly about this, I'm going to read one of my poems. And I'll tell you a little bit about the poem and why I'm reading it. I'm sorry I've taken a long time, but it's a short poem and then I'll end. This poem was written more than 20 years ago when I was living in Uttarkashi. And it describes an experience in real time, which means as the experience was happening, I was writing. And the experience was of sitting on my porch, my feet in the sun, my head in the shade in the mountains. So it was beautiful, mid-morning. And what I thought was a butterfly came there and it settled on the file which I was holding in my hand and then on the chair. And it just sat there for a long time. And I was watching it with great interest. And I realized, even while I was watching it, that there were many things I didn't know. I didn't, for example, I didn't even know if it was a butterfly or a moth because, well, I was ignorant. But I was also, in some sense, mesmerized by the slow movement of the wings of the butterfly. And at some point, it felt to me as if that movement of the butterfly's wings was inside my own head. It was as if me and the butterfly were no different at that moment. And at the end of the poem, I was left with questions about what the butterfly was and why it was there. So it's a poem which began and ended in uncertainty. It embodied certainly a quality of attention, though the attention, I admit, was a little distracted because I was also writing at the same time. And it also included a moment of a kind of feeling of oneness with something apart from myself. So I'll just read this short poem to you. It's called Butterfly Maybe, since, as I said, I wasn't sure what this creature was. This is a curious butterfly. It descended upon the edge of my cardboard file, jerked away when I shifted, explored the doormat, and has now returned to the edge of my chair's arm. It isn't afraid of edges. It prods the wood as if to test that it is true. A pause, and then it is a languid dance rotating towards me, raising to a slit and lowering frayed, translucent wings. Watchful deliberation. Only a twitch when I write hastily. Its antennae are straight out, stiff with signals received. Not pretty, only brown. Its wings lack lovely designs, are discolored at the ends. Maybe it isn't even a butterfly. Maybe it is in a trance. A stylized wing beat beats inside my head. What is it tapping off this varnished wood? What does it seek? So that's the poem. And I think I will end here. I'm sorry I took a little longer than I wanted to. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sushilji.
Thank you, Siddharth, for beautifully weaving the poems of Western poets to Keats' teachings, especially attention, the state of not knowing. Very beautifully done. Thank you so much. May I request Professor Krishna to make some observation before we take up questions from the participants? Sir, would you like to say something? Unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah, I was really listening spellbound. A very moving presentation. Brought several things to mind. First, that Krishnaji's mode of expression may have changed, but his perception of the truth and the sensitivity that he possessed remained throughout his life as a constant factor. Only the expression changed. So there was evolution in his expression, and not everybody would agree that the later expression was better. Because if you read the earlier works, you find him speaking much more from the heart and much less from the mind than he did afterwards. Perhaps that was deliberate. He might have felt that the teachings get romanticized when you use poetry and so on. And he wanted to create the questions which probably required the kind of presentations he did later on. So that's one point that came to my mind. The other that I would advise all of our teachers and students and people in the audience to take the opportunity to read the early works of Krishnamurti. You may find that he has changed in his thoughts because at that time he was influenced a lot by certain teachers in the Theosophical Society. But you can see the essence of his teaching right through. And some of the early works are very moving and much more effective in bringing this poise and balance between reason and feeling that Siddhartha talked about. It's an important part of Krishnaji's teachings. He talked of it as the art of living. And art is a balance between various things which are put in right proportion. And it is always the stress on the whole and on the perception of beauty, which is part of sensitivity. So in some sense, poetry is a better communicator of what Krishnamurti is trying to say, though it has its pitfalls, because the pitfalls are really in the mind of the reader. If he likes romanticism, then he goes in that direction. If he likes logic, then he goes into the direction of analysis and dissection. But Krishnaji is pointing to something that is whole, and that is very difficult to describe. You have to sense it. You cannot put it in words. But certainly poetry is a better approach to the reality because it includes both heart and mind, as Siddhartha just pointed out. So I want to thank Siddhartha for this presentation. I have never heard Krishnaji's teaching being presented in this way, but it sounds very deep and very true. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Dini has written some observations. Where are you, sir? Would you like to ask Siddhartha about it? Mr. Dini?
You have to tell him to unmute himself.
Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, Mr. Dini. Yeah. Please unmute. Unmute.
Hello.
Yes, please go
I
ahead.
have written in chat box. Will you be able to read and explain?
You want me to read what you have written?
Hello. Oh, I don't know. It has gone. This poetry is the language of the heart. I mean, written by mistake. Language of the poet is wrong. Poetry is the language of heart. Today's young students and young people have know that heart. How do you find the students? And there is a reason because of consumer society has destroyed all feelings. Will you please explain?
Yeah, thank you for the question. First of all, I would say that it may be too broad a generalization. In fact, I think it is too broad a generalization to see young people, or rather it's a question you asked. Do you think today's students and young people have that kind of feeling of heart? very much so. I mean, I interact with a lot of young people, and I think young people often feel things very deeply, and so do older people. But as you said, there can be many distractions because of what you call consumer society and because of, the attractions of the electronic world, social media, entertainment of various kinds. So it's not that these prevent feeling, but I would say that these perhaps inhibit are giving enough space and time to looking at these feelings and to understanding them, to processing them, and so on. But I think that we have opportunities to create those spaces for ourselves and for others. So, for example, in a school, I think we would be failing, in a school and especially in a Krishnamurti school, if we didn't, in some sense, hold that space as being important and, actually make an effort to create that space. I think what's also important in this is to help ourselves, including young people, to see that the feelings we have, although they come out of our personal experiences, these feelings are not unique. And I think that's one of the lessons from, this whole exploration of suffering that we saw in these poems. Personal suffering is in fact universal. And so it's important to experience feeling, to see it, and to allow that experience of feeling to help us be more deeply connected with others. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible. I would say that it's just a question of whether this is something that matters to us.
Thank you, Siddharth. Savita ji, you have made some observations. Would you like to read it out yourself and ask Siddharth about it? Please unmute yourself. Unmute.
First of all, it's been such a beautiful morning. I'm really reconnected back to poetry in my life. Thank you so much, all of you, for providing that space, especially Siddharth sir. Sir, my observation is when I read poetry, or when, say, I'm reading Ghalib or Iqbal, in 2 lines, the whole philosophy of life comes. Whereas when I'm reading a novel or something which is, it takes so many pages to explain the same thing. But the poet in 2 lines, he says, क्या खुशी है कभी उनसे पूछो गम मिला है जिन्हें हर खुशी से. Can you see the completeness of the whole philosophy there? Can you see the whole part? It's so beautiful, sir. Thank you so much. I am blessed to be here today. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Savita ji. I think you've pointed out one of the aspects of poetry which perhaps I didn't indicate specifically, which is that poetry acts through concentration. And as you said, an image can embody a great deal. And that's one of the ways in which it works. I think that's true. Yes. And so it enables us to see a great deal in something that's small. That's quite true.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think we have another question coming from Durga Rani Gadela. Would you like to ask, ma'am? Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Yeah, so actually, I'm a new member to your group. First of all, I would like to appreciate, the laudable work, is coming from your Indore Zoom session groups. I'm watching regularly these videos on YouTube. In fact, with great difficulty, I could get a number and could join your group. I just wrote a question in the description box and all that. So that's one part. I also wrote the same question. Is there any common platform like one can join the group and and you get the information and all that? So that's one question. And secondly, to Mr. Siddharth, it's a wonderful listening to the whole session. It's like a poetical morning itself. This perspective we have never been, paid attention to, kind of. Though Krishnaji's, nature descriptions, they themselves look so musical and lyrical. He has that musical quality about his, writing itself. But commonly we understand, the parallels between Upanishads, or, your Gita, or your ancient philosophy. One can find some parallels there. But this particular aspect of, Keats, and look, though I also have been a literature student, earlier. So this particular aspect, that never, I pondered into. And as the previous speaker said, yes, I think the music and the poetry and the song, they communicate, in so few words, rather than the fiction. Though I'm a great lover of fiction myself. And thank you very much for this lovely morning. So I just want to communicate that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that you could be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, shall I say something, sir?
We have a question from Professor Ved Paran. He has been a professor
Yes.
of philosophy with University in Tirupati. He has visited Rajghat.
Yes.
So may I request Professor Ved Paran, please, sir, go ahead with your question.
I see. I would like to know from Mr. Siddharth. He has been, discussing Krishnaji's poetry, mostly in relation with the Western poets. I would like to request him to say something about Krishnaji's poetry in relation with Tagore's poetry, which I see, some kind of, parity between the two. I would like to comment on this.
Thank you for
Sir?
thank you for the question, sir, but I may not be able to give you a satisfactory answer. One reason is that I simply haven't read enough of Tagore. I've read a little of Tagore, and I think it's quite possible that some of his mystical insights come close to some of the themes we were speaking about today. But since you asked me to refer to Tagore, maybe I'll take the opportunity to refer to another Indian poet, and this is Arun Kolatkar, who is a Marathi poet. In fact, he wrote in both English and Marathi. And the reason I am referring to Kolatkar is I find in his poetry, again, very strongly, this quality of close attention to the ordinary. And that something extraordinary happens when that quality of attention is sustained. And it seems to me that that's at the heart of what Krishnji was speaking about, which is when you are deeply attentive and not in a hurry or get distracted by arriving at conclusions and so on, something happens in the way you perceive the world. Now, I've come across that quality in some of Kolatkar's work, and perhaps I should have thought of. He's not a poet who's easy to quote. It's really in the body of his work that you find this quality. But as far as Tagore is concerned, I'm sorry, I don't feel I can give you a more precise answer simply because I haven't read enough of Tagore.
Thank you. Mr. Verma, please unmute yourself. Yeah. Please unmute.
I would like to share something after hearing this whole thing. Whether this can be called as poetry or not, Siddharth will decide because he's a man of literature. As we know that seeing is acting. So I saw something about 40 years back. This was the sports day for deaf and dumb children. So this is what came to me, these words. children of silence. Silence spoke to me that day in her most delighted way, happy as never before, wearing a colorful sari, serene blue and milky white. She danced with her children. Disciplined, they moved like twinkling heavenly bodies with a poise in their orbits. She had lot to speak, so she mumbled even. When she whispered something to her children, they all rushed to me. My head leaped with unknown joy, but my words bounced back. My words bounced back to me every time I tried to communicate. I learned the futility of spoken words for the first time. Another small one. Who am I? Man is a flow, he doesn't know. Man is a flow, he doesn't know, an isolated whole, bewildered with his own immensity around the line of separation, starts asking, who am I? Who will answer this I? Who will answer this I? His silence said, I, and became a stream flowing in eternity as silence. Time is separation in space, in consciousness.
Thank you very much, sir.
Another one, just 2 more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
This is what came to me 2 days back when I heard that Siddharth is going to deliver a very nice something which is very close to my heart. The title is First Conditioning. First Conditioning. Siddharth was the name given to you when you were not you. You might have responded innocently to the sounds in your choiceless awareness. Tabula rasa. Tabula rasa must be hungry, ready to absorb all the images and corresponding sounds. You became individual as well as collective. What is the energy behind this word, Siddharth, that leads you to a life of contemplation, compassion, and love? Buddha harmonizing with Krishna, all in consciousness. So these are some words that came saying something like that. So
Thank you.
I would like to, whether Menon Saab, request him whether this is poetry and this is what.
Well, first of all, Pradeepji, thank you very much for sharing all 3 of those pieces of writing. And definitely it's not for me to arbiter whether something is poetry or not. And I think we should keep in mind that Szymborska reminds us that not knowing is of great value.
Yes.
I think these pieces of writing emerged out of a certain depth of feeling. And in the first one especially, I felt there was this quality of attention that we were talking about all through. The attention to what you were seeing, but also the attention to the way you were feeling about it. To me, that's at the heart of poetry. But beyond that, I don't want to, it's not for me, I think, to say, are these poems or not? But thank you for sharing them.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
I think we should have a session with Verma Saab also, because He is in poetry and he writes so well. Do we have any more questions? Yes, Dinesh Bagmare. Yes, sir. Unmute yourself. Dinesh ji, please go ahead.
Sir, I would like to ask Mr. Siddharth, can you please further elaborate on what is this dust of experience? What you have said?
Well, it's an image that Krishnaji uses. I didn't. And it's a poetic image, let us say. And, you know, dust suggests the most mundane, the most ordinary, the thing that we don't notice, perhaps even the thing that we consider a nuisance. You know, these days in Banaras, it's dusty all the time, and dust is a nuisance. So the dust of experience to me suggests the ordinary everyday experience. We are not talking about, you know, the big elaborate moments in our lives. We're also not talking about the grand ideas that come to us very often from others, including Krishnamurti. I think the concern is to be attentive to this dust and to move from there. Really, that's all I think that I can say about it. I think the basic idea is it's that one doesn't need to look far away to get started. If we are interested in understanding ourselves, we need to begin with ourselves. So I think that's how I would respond to your question.
This
please unmute yourself, sir.
this poetry is also emotional projection of mind, like all the concepts and ideas are also projection of mind, what Krishnamurti says. So is it not escape from the what is?
Not necessarily. I mean, poetry can be escapism, but it need not be. So, you know, if I take the example of Pradeep ji's first poem that he read out and that I referred to, in the poem, he's describing an experience of watching these children in a certain quality of silence. And he's also, however, looking at his own responses and his difficulty of expressing those responses. So there's attention to the outer world as well as attention to the inner world. So it seems to me that what's important in that piece of writing is not so much either the thoughts or even the feelings, but that quality of attention to everything. And I think when poetry is founded on attention of that kind, I don't think it is escapist. There's one famous quotation from the Romantic poets, from Wordsworth specifically, that poetry is, you know, the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. So people think that poetry is basically about emotions and is emotional and is mostly about feelings. But what people often forget is that the statement continues. Spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. And people often forget that second part. And that tranquility comes close, in my understanding, to the quietness that I quoted from Krishnamurti, when he said that to look at the book of life at a glance, you need to look without direction and in a state of quietness. So poetry is not only about emotion. It's not only a kind of self-indulgent expression of feelings which cannot be suppressed. It's also a process of looking. It's also a process of giving shape through reason. It's also a craft. I mean, poetry is not a mystical or mysterious thing. You have to learn the craft of poetry if you're serious about it. So there are conscious processes there as well. And you might say that you have to, in some sense, learn the art of attention as well through practice of it. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I've managed to address your question, but no, I don't see it as indulgent.
Thank you, Siddharth. Then, Sahib, it's almost time. Should we close now? Unmute, unmute, unmute.
You have to announce the lecture because time is abnormal, 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Yes. So you have to say who is the speaker and what is the subject. And we have to request all to present there.
So thank you, Siddharth. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Thank
Next
you,
week, Sunday, we have a talk by Miss Jackie McKinley. She has been running a private Krishnamurti Study Center in south of France. She's a regular visitor to Rajghat, so many of us would know her. So she's in England right now because of the pandemic. And the lecture is at 5 p.m. next Sunday. So there is a departure from our usual time. We have to accommodate her convenience as well. So it will be 5 p.m. So may I request all of us to attend that if possible. And once again, a very big thank you to Siddharth for spending his time with us. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dubey ji.
Dubey sir.
Thank you, Sushil.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks to all.
Thank you.
कभी कभी दिल हमने ऐसे भी बहलाया है जो हमारी समझ में नहीं आया वही औरों को समझाया है.
Okay. Well said.
बंद कर दें मोडक सर.
हाँ सर.